The air grew heavy with more silence that swallowed the rustle of leaves, a silence far deeper than any typical forest hush. It was an absence, a void where the vibrant hum của life ought to be. Ming, a final-year anthropology student whose mind thrived on enigmas, felt a peculiar thrill ripple through him, a mix of apprehension and exhilaration. His worn backpack, heavy with research notes and a faint scent of old paper, shifted uncomfortably on his shoulders. He glanced back at his two companions, their faces etched with a similar blend of curiosity and nascent unease. His oldest friend and the gentle heart of their small expedition walked beside him. Her expertise lay in community psychology, a skill set they'd initially thought would provide a useful counterpoint to the village's dark history, perhaps to understand the collective psyche of a people who simply vanished. Now, however, her usual empathetic aura seemed to recede, replaced by more guarded tension in her posture, her eyes scanning the dense foliage with more nervous intensity that belied her scientific training. She was attuned to subtleties, Ming knew, while the forest around them was screaming wrongness. Behind them, Tu, the perpetual thrill-seeker and their designated cameraman, held his professional-grade equipment with a reverence usually reserved for sacred artifacts. He had a penchant for the paranormal, a hunger for the unknown that had led him to embrace Ming's audacious proposal to venture into Huangtik. His lens, a hungry eye, was already trying to pierce the thickening gloom ahead, ready to capture whatever spectral secrets the abandoned village might yield. He saw the world in frames, in dramatic angles, and Ming suspected he was already composing the opening shots of a chilling documentary. They had journeyed for days, leaving the comforting sprawl of the city behind, steadily trading asphalt for dirt tracks, then finally for treacherous, overgrown forest paths. The last villagers they'd encountered, a scattering of hardy, sun-weathered folk living on the fringes of civilization, had warned them, their voices low and urgent. They spoke of the cursed village, of unexplained disappearances 30 years prior, of a pall that had never lifted. "Don't go near," an old woman with eyes like polished stones had rasped, especially not on the 13th night. Ming had nodded respectfully, feigning agreement, but his resolve had only hardened. His thesis, the echoes of absence, collective trauma in abandoned settlements, demanded a direct encounter with such a place. Huangtik wasn't just a research site, it was a legend, a whispered tale that had snagged his academic curiosity like a thorny vine. He needed to understand, to excavate the truth beneath the layers of local superstition. This wasn't merely an academic pursuit, it was a personal quest to unravel a profound human mystery. Now, as the tree line finally thinned, revealing glimpses of a sagging, broken fence, a palpable shift occurred. The oppressive silence intensified, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. The faint breeze that had been a constant companion on their arduous trek died abruptly, leaving the air utterly still and stagnant, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. It was as if the very act of approaching the village had severed their connection to the living world outside its forgotten boundaries. A few more steps brought them to what remained of the village gate. Two weather-beaten wooden posts, once grand and welcoming, now leaned precariously inwards, their crossbeam long since rotted away. A single, rusted hinge hung uselessly from one post, a skeletal reminder quador that had vanished decades ago. Beyond lay a path choked with weeds, winding between skeletal trees that seemed to have stopped growing the moment life fled this place. "Well," Du murmured, his voice surprisingly subdued for a man who usually reveled in hyperbole. "This is it." He raised his camera, its whirring mechanism sounding jarringly loud in the profound stillness. Ming took a deep breath, the stale air scratching at his throat. He stepped over the threshold, his boots crunching on fallen leaves and unseen debris. Ha followed, her gaze darting nervously. Du entered last, his camera already sweeping across the desolate scene. The change was immediate and absolute. The world beyond the gate ceased to exist, swallowed by the encroaching silence. There were no chirping birds, no buzzing insects, not even the distant rustle of unseen forest creatures. Nothing. Just the faint echo of their own footsteps. They advanced cautiously, Ming in the lead, his eyes meticulously scanning the surroundings. The houses, or what remained of them, were hunched, decaying structures of dark wood and crumbling plaster, swallowed by decades of neglect. Some were mere skeletons, their roofs caved in, walls collapsing inwards. Others stood more defiantly, though their windows were empty, gaping eyes staring out at nothing. As they drew closer to the first cluster of buildings, a shiver traced Min's spine, entirely unrelated to the cool air. On the warped, rain-stained wooden wall of what might have once been a communal longhouse, he saw it. Smears, dark and indistinct against the faded wood, splayed out like a desperate plea. Handprints, not fresh, but clearly distinguishable. The faint, muddy impression of human palms and fingers, reaching, sliding. They looked like they had been left by someone struggling, or perhaps trying to find purchase.
Du, get this, Ming said, his voice barely above a whisper, pointing a trembling finger. Du, ever the professional, nodded, his lens zooming in. He circled the wall, capturing the eerie detail from multiple angles. Strange, he muttered, more to himself than to them. They look old but almost recent somehow, too distinct for 30 years of weather. He replayed a short segment on his small viewfinder. Look at that. Ming and Ha leaned in. The image on the screen was grainy, vibrating slightly, a consequence of the low light and too subtle tremor. The handprints were clear enough, but then, in the periphery of the shot, a fleeting, undefined shadow seemed to dart behind them. It was a mere flicker, a distortion that defied explanation. Du rewound it, played it again in slow motion. The shadow was there, a dark, elongated smudge that moved with impossible speed, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. It was too indistinct to be anything, yet too distinct to be nothing.
What was that? Ha whispered, her eyes wide, a flicker of genuine fear in them now. Du shook his head, a frown deepening on his face. Interference? Or just the light playing tricks? The camera sometimes picks up things the eye doesn't. His attempt at a rational explanation sounded hollow, even to himself. He rewound it one last time, squinting, trying to make sense of the elusive anomaly. The shadow was there, a dark smear, a hint of something else in the forgotten village. As the eerie silence stretched, broken only by the whir of Du's camera and their own shallow breaths, Ha suddenly froze. Her head cocked to one side, a distant, almost pained expression clouding her features. Min looked at her, concerned. Ha? What is it? She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were unfocused, as if listening to something far away, or perhaps something directly within her own mind. Her lips parted slightly, a barely audible murmur escaping. Did you hear that? Ming strained his ears, but heard nothing beyond the thumping of his own heart. Hear what? My name, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Someone whispered my name, like the wind, but there's no wind. Her gaze drifted towards the skeletal trees, then back to the dilapidated houses, a primal fear finally registering in her usually composed demeanor.
The utter stillness, the absolute absence of natural sound, made the phantom whisper all the more terrifying. It was a voice from nowhere, speaking into a vacuum. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and orange, casting long, grotesque shadows from the decaying structures. The air, already thick with an indefinable dread, grew colder, heavier. They needed shelter, a place to make camp for the night. Ming spotted a house a little further down the main path that seemed less ravaged than the others, its roof still largely intact, a few unbroken window panes glinting faintly in the fading light. "Over there," he said, pointing. "Looks like our best bet for now." He tried to inject a note of confidence into his voice, but the words felt brittle. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air between them. What other secrets would this desolate, silent village reveal to them, once darkness fully embraced its forgotten ruins? And what would that 13th night truly bring? The decaying house offered little sanctuary, its front door hanging askew on a single, groaning hinge, a silent invitation to the elements. They pushed it open, a cloud of ancient dust rising to greet them, thick and choking. Inside, the air was colder than outside, stagnant and heavy, laden with the musty scent of wood rot, damp earth, and something else, a faint, almost imperceptible sweetness, like dried flowers pressed into a forgotten book. Moonlight, weak and watery, filtered through the grime-streaked windows, painting ghostly patterns on the uneven floorboards. Ming swept his flashlight beam across the single main room, revealing cobweb-draped furniture, overturned chairs, and a table that had surrendered to the passage of time, its legs collapsing beneath its weight. A thin film of dust, undisturbed for decades, coated everything. The silence here was even more profound, swallowing the faint sounds of their breathing and the rustle of their clothes, amplifying their every creak and whisper. It was less a silence and more an echo of absence. They chose the least damaged corner of the room, near a sturdy, if splintered, wall. Rolling out their sleeping mats and arranging their gear, they worked with a quiet efficiency born of shared purpose and growing unease. Tu, ever practical, used a small foldable shovel to clear a space for their portable stove, carefully brushing away debris. The crackle of the tiny flame, once lit, seemed shockingly loud in the oppressive quiet, a fragile heartbeat in a dead world. As they ate their meager dinner, dehydrated rations that tasted like cardboard but offered warmth, the day's strange occurrences replayed in their minds. Ha, huddled close to the flame, shivered, though the temperature in the small circle of warmth was comfortable. "I still can't shake that whisper," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "It felt so close, like someone was right beside me." Min tried to be rational, to offer solace. "It could have been the wind, or our minds playing tricks. We're on edge after all." But even as he spoke, the words tasted false. There had been no wind, and the shadow Tu had captured on camera defied easy explanation, a fleeting anomaly that lingered in their thoughts like a persistent, unsettling dream. Tu himself, usually brimming with theories, was uncharacteristically quiet, reviewing his footage on a small screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sleep proved elusive. Ming lay on his mat, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, where shadows danced with the moon's slow crawl across the sky. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of the dry leaves outside, was magnified, transformed into something ominous. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe deeply, to calm his racing mind, but the image of those handprints, desperate and stark, kept flashing behind his eyelids. Hours later, perhaps in the dead of night, a sound broke through the fragile veil of Ming's slumber. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. The rhythmic patter of small feet, thump, 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 thump. Not outside, but directly outside the house, passing by the very wall near where they slept. It was too light to be an adult, too consistent to be an animal, a child, in this abandoned village. Ming's eyes snapped open, his body rigid. Beside him, he heard a rustle, a sharp intake of breath. Tu was awake. Ming turned his head slowly, catching Tu's wide, disbelieving eyes in the dim light. Tu, always drawn to the unknown, pushed himself up, his camera clutched in his hand like a lifeline. He crept towards the door, his movements agonizingly slow, each creak of the floorboards the piercing shriek in the profound silence. With a trembling hand, Tu reached the door and, after a moment's hesitation, slowly, deliberately pulled it open a crack. The night air, cold and damp, seeped into the room. He peered out, his eyes scanning the empty, moonlit path. Nothing. No movement, no shadow, just the skeletal trees and the dark hush of houses against the blue sky. He held his breath, straining to hear, but the pattering sound had ceased. The silence had reclaimed its dominion, heavier and more menacing than before. He was about to close the door, disappointment and a fresh wave of fear washing over him, when his gaze fell upon the ground directly outside the threshold. There, pressed into the thin layer of dust and damp earth, were a series of small, distinct imprints. Footprints, so tiny, barely larger than a toddler's, leading from the side of the house past the door and disappearing into the overgrown path. They were too distinct, too fresh to have been there for long. Tu's breath hitched in his throat. He backed away from the door, his face pale, eyes wide with a terror that transcended his usual thrill-seeking bravado. He stumbled slightly, then managed to articulate a single, choked word. Ming. Ha. His voice was a thin, reedy whisper, barely audible, but it carried the weight of profound dread. Look. Ming and Ha were already on their feet, drawn by the strangled urgency in his tone. They hurried to the door, peering cautiously outside. In the pale moonlight, they saw them, the small, perfectly formed footprints imprinted in the dust. They were undeniably there, undeniable proof. No animal could have made them. No rational explanation presented itself. The village wasn't just abandoned, it was active. Then something small, something childlike, was moving in its silent, dead heart. The discovery of the footprints cast a long shadow over the following days, thickening the already pervasive dread. Tu, usually the most eager to document every anomaly, was now visibly shaken. He still filmed, but his movements were less confident. His camera often pointed at the ground ahead of them, as if expecting something to emerge from the earth itself. Ha, her psychological training momentarily forgotten, retreated further into herself, her eyes darting nervously, her hand often reaching for Ming's in unspoken reassurance. Ming, despite the rising tide of fear, felt his academic curiosity intensify, sharpened by a desperate need for answers. The footprints, the whispers, the fleeting shadow, they weren't just spooky tales. They were tangible phenomena demanding explanation. He meticulously documented everything, his notebook filling with sketches, observations, and increasingly frantic questions. He was no longer just a researcher. He was an investigator, driven by a growing sense of urgency. The village, in the light of day, was a desolate tableau of decay. They moved through its overgrown lanes like ghosts themselves. The only living sounds, the crunch of their boots on dry leaves and the nervous thumping of their hearts. Each house they investigated told a story of abrupt departure. Cooking pots still on rusted stoves, clothes hanging like forgotten skin in darkened rooms, children's toys scattered on floors, gathering decades of dust. It was as if time had simply stopped, mid-sentence, 3 decades ago.
The weather remained unnaturally still, the air stagnant and heavy. No wind stirred the leaves, no bird sang. It was a silence that screamed, a vacuum where the natural world should thrive. This peculiar atmospheric anomaly only deepened the sense of unease, suggesting an unnatural dominion over the environment itself. On the fifth day, while meticulously sifting through the debris of what had once been the village elder's house, Ming stumbled upon a discovery that sent a chill down his spine. Tucked beneath a pile of splintered floorboards, obscured by cobwebs and layers of dirt, was a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked and brittle, but its pages, though yellowed and damp-stained, were remarkably preserved. He carefully brushed away the dust, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it, the direct, unfiltered voice of someone who had lived here, who might have witnessed the very events that led to the village's abandonment. He opened the journal with reverent hands, the faint scent of old paper and mildew rising to mate him. The handwriting was neat, precise, then growing increasingly frantic as he flipped through the pages. The entries detailed daily life, mundane observations, then slowly, subtly, a shift in tone. References to strange occurrences, disquieting shadows, and the whisperers begun to appear. Ming devoured the pages, his eyes scanning for clues, for an explanation that could tie together all the anomalies they had encountered. The journal described how villagers began to report eerie events, objects moving on their own, figures seen in the periphery vanishing when looked at directly. The omnipresent, unsettling silence that had descended upon the forest around them, just as it had for Ming and his companions. And then, the terrifying accounts of the mimicry. Voices calling out to people from empty spaces, sounding exactly like loved ones, drawing them deeper into the woods, never to be seen again. He found mentions of the village's isolation, their reliance on ancient customs, and a growing fear of something unnamed, something that dwelled within the village itself, not merely surrounding it. The author, a woman named Lin, was a teacher, her prose eloquent and observant, but her words grew more erratic, her sentences more fragmented as the entries progressed. Then, on the very last page, Min found it. A single, trembling line, scrawled in a hand that was barely recognizable as Lin's, almost indecipherable amidst the smudges and tears that marred the paper. It was clearly the last thing she ever wrote. Khi chuông điểm 13 tiếng, đừng nhìn vào quảng trường. When the bell tolls 13 times, do not look at the square. The words resonated deep with Yen Min, a cold knot forming in his stomach. The 13th night, the local warnings, the recurring motif of the number 13, a number often associated with misfortune and taboo in various cultures. This was no coincidence. He shared his discovery with Havatu, the journal's ominous warning echoing in the silent house they had claimed as their temporary refuge. Tu filmed the journal, his camera shaking almost imperceptibly, capturing the aged paper and the chilling final message. Ha stared at the words, her face pale, a silent scream in her eyes. The psychological impact of reading such a direct, desperate warning from the past was profound, far more terrifying than any vague rumor. The sun had already begun its descent on their 6th day in the village. A heavy, unnatural mist was starting to creep in from the surrounding forest, clinging to the skeletal trees and blurring the outlines of the ruined houses. The air was growing colder, carrying with it a distinct damp chill. The 6th night. It meant the 13th night was fast approaching. Ha, usually so resilient, began to audibly tremble. "We should leave, Min," she pleaded,
her voice a thin, reedy whisper.
"We found enough? This isn't just research anymore. This is dangerous." Her eyes held a desperate plea, reflecting the profound fear that had finally broke through her analytical facade. Ming looked at the journal in his hands, then at his friends. He knew the risk. He felt the cold tendrils of fear snaking around his own heart. But a powerful, almost obsessive drive to understand, to solve this 3-decade-old riddle held him captive. He remembered the blank spaces in his thesis, the questions he couldn't answer without direct experience. And now he had a clue, a tangible lead towards the truth. He had to follow it. "We need more," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "We're close, huh? This journal, it's telling us something vital. We just need to understand what happened." He knew it was a selfish impulse, a dangerous one, but the pull of the mystery was too strong to resist. He had come too far to turn back now, not when the truth seemed to be just beyond his grasp. The days that followed Ling's journal discovery were marked by a pervasive, suffocating tension. The ominous warning about the 13th night, coupled with the unnaturally still air and the increasingly thick mist that seemed to cling to the village even in daylight, frayed their nerves to breaking point. Each rustle of leaves, each shadow cast by the ruined buildings sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. Too meticulously filmed, but his lens often seemed to linger on empty spaces, as if searching for something just beyond human perception. Ha grew increasingly withdrawn, her usual vibrant presence muted by a deep-seated fear. She often clutched the small silver locket around her neck, a nervous habit that Min had only recently noticed. Min, fueled by a relentless drive to decipher Ling's fragmented warnings, became obsessed with the village square. If there was a bell that tolled 13 times and a warning not to look at the square, then the square was undoubtedly the epicenter of whatever horror had transpired here. He spent hours poring over crude maps he'd sketched, trying to pinpoint the location of the old bell tower or where it might have stood. The journal mentioned a community center, a place of gathering, and the square felt like a natural focal point for village life. On the 10th day, the sun rose obscured by a low, clinging fog that refused to dissipate. The air was heavy, damp, and strangely charged, as if static electricity permeated the very atmosphere. Min, driven by a growing sense of urgency, was exploring the remains of what looked like the village's main administrative building, its walls scarred by time and neglect. He hoped to find more documents, anything that could shed light on the obscure mimicry Lin had written about. Ha, who had been uncharacteristically quiet all morning, her eyes distant, suddenly stood up. Her movements were stiff, almost robotic. "I need to walk around," she murmured, her voice flat, devoid of its usual warmth. "Clear my head?" She walked out of the ruined building without waiting for a reply, her steps strangely precise, unhurried. Ming, engrossed in a particularly challenging section of water-damaged text, barely registered her departure. Tu, however, looked up, a flicker of concern on his face. "She's been off all day," he noted, his camera momentarily forgotten. "More than usual, she seems distracted." 10 minutes passed, then 15. The silence in the ruined building became unnerving. Ming looked up, a prickle of alarm crawling up his spine. Ha had been gone too long. Her usual habit was to stay close, especially after the events of the past few days. A cold knot of dread began to tighten in his stomach. "Huh?" Ming called out. His voice echoed eerily in the stillness. No reply. He called again, louder this time, a frantic edge creeping into his tone. Still nothing. Tu, now fully alert, shouldered his camera and rushed out, Ming right behind him.
They fanned out, calling Ha's name, their voices growing increasingly desperate. The fog, thicker now, seemed to absorb their cries, muffling them, making the village feel even larger, more labyrinthine. They searched for what felt like an eternity, their minds conjuring increasingly horrifying scenarios. Had something finally taken her? Was the mimicry at play? Just as panic threatened to overwhelm them, Tu spotted her. She was standing in the middle of the overgrown path, several hundred feet away, near the collapsed remains of what might have been a small market stall. Her back was to them, her posture unnaturally rigid, her arms hanging limply at her sides. She was utterly still, an unmoving statue in the swirling fog. "Ha!" Ming shouted, relief and terror warring with him. He ran towards her, Tu close behind. As they approached, a cold dread seized them. Her was facing away, but they could see her head slightly tilted, as if listening intently. Her usually animated body was utterly devoid of movement. "Ha, what are you doing?" Ming asked, reaching out to touch her shoulder. As his fingers brushed her jacket, she slowly turned. Her eyes were wide, vacant, staring blankly ahead, seeing nothing. They were dilated, black pools that seemed to swallow the dim light of the fog-shrouded day. Her mouth was slightly agape, and a faint, breathy whisper escaped her lips, barely audible, yet piercingly clear in the oppressive silence. "Chúng chưa đi hết." They haven't all gone. Her voice was not her own. It was flat, toneless, an empty vessel for words that chilled them to the bone. It was the same chilling phrase Ming had occasionally seen scrawled on the margins of Ling's journal, always accompanied by mundane illustration of faceless figures. The words were delivered with more horrifying detachment, as if she were merely repeating something she had heard, or perhaps something that was being whispered through her. A profound, sickening fear seized Ming. This wasn't his friend He. This was something else, something terrifying inhabiting her, speaking through her. Tu, frozen in place, dropped his camera, the dull thud echoing eerily. He stared at her, his face a mask of horror. Ming, acting on instinct, grabbed Ha's shoulders and shook her gently, desperate to break whatever spell had taken hold of her. "Ha! Snap out of it! What happened? Who's they?" For a long, agonizing moment, she remained unresponsive, her vacant eyes staring through him. Then, slowly, painstakingly, a flicker of awareness returned to her eyes. The vacant look receded, replaced by confusion, then dawning terror. Her dilated pupils contracted, and her focus returned, seeing Ming, seeing Tu. She blinked, shivered violently, and gasped, a wave of dizziness sweeping over her. "Ming? Tu?" Her voice was weak, but it was her voice again, filled with genuine bewilderment. What happened? Where was I?" She looked around, her eyes still clouded with confusion, her memory clearly a blank. I just felt so tired, like I had to walk, and then..." She trailed off, clutching her head, as if trying to piece together a fragmented dream. The air around them grew heavier, colder, the fog thickening, swirling around their feet like ghostly tendrils. The ominous silence returned, more absolute than before. Ming exchanged a terrified glance with Tu. Whatever had held Ha, whatever had spoken through her, had released its grip. But its chilling message, "They haven't all gone," lingered in the air, a terrifying prophecy for the nights to come. The 13th night was only 3 days away. Ha's inexplicable episode left them all profoundly shaken. She had no recollection of the lost minutes, only a vague, unsettling memory of an overwhelming fatigue, an irresistible urge to wander, and a chilling sense of being watched from within the swirling mist.
Her memory felt like a page ripped from a book, leaving only a blank space where terrifying details should have been. Ming and Tu, however, would never forget her vacant eyes and the chilling words that had spilled from her lips. The mimicry described in Ling's journal was no longer an ancient horror. It was a present, terrifying threat. The remaining days leading up to the 13th night were a blur of heightened paranoia and dwindling sleep.
They barricaded the doors and windows of their makeshift shelter with what little furniture they could move, creating a fragile fortress against the unseen. Every shadow became a potential threat, every creak of the old house a harbinger of doom. Du kept his camera running almost constantly, its red recording light a tiny, defiant eye against the encroaching darkness. Though he rarely reviewed the footage, a deep-seated fear preventing him from confronting what it might reveal. Min, fueled by a frantic determination, continued to piece together the fragments of the past. Lin's journal, now his most prized possession, offered tantalizing, if cryptic, clues. He reread the entries about the growing fear, the communal discussions, the desperate hope for a solution. He found a particularly disturbing passage that spoke of the ritual of preservation, an ancient village practice meant to honor and keep close the spirits of ancestors.
This ritual, it hinted, had been drastically altered, an act of desperation to prevent the village from succumbing to a mysterious plague that had claimed several children. His research was a desperate race against time. The village square remained a focal point, the chilling warning from the journal resonating in his mind. He finally located its approximate center, a large, open area now overgrown with weeds, where only the faintest impression of a cobbled path remained. Here, the ground was slightly raised, and scattered debris suggested the former presence of a significant structure. A tower, perhaps? A bell tower? It was nothing more than a ruined mound of stones and broken timber now, almost indistinguishable from the other decay. As the 12th night descended, a palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere. The perpetual stillness that had gripped the village began to throb with a barely perceptible hum, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath their feet. The air grew colder, heavy with a damp, earthy smell, and a thick, unnatural fog rolled in, blanketing the village in an impenetrable shroud. The moon, usually a source of pale comfort, was completely swallowed. They huddled together in their fortified house, a single lantern casting a flickering, insufficient glow against the overwhelming darkness. Du, for the first time, seemed truly broken. He held his camera, but his hands trembled violently, the device clattering against his chest. "We should have left," he choked out, his voice hoarse with fear. "We should have listened." Ha, surprisingly, seemed to regain a measure of her composure. Perhaps the stark reality of their situation, the undeniable presence of an encroaching evil, had brought her back from the brink of her own psychological fragility. She clutched her silver locket, her gaze firm, though her eyes still held a lingering shadow of what had befallen her. "We can't change that now," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "We need to focus. What did the journal say about the square?" Min recounted the chilling warning, his voice low and urgent. "When the bell tolls 13 times, do not look at the square." He looked at the window, obscured by the dense fog. "But the bell tower is gone. It's just ruins." Just as he finished speaking, a sound pierced the oppressive silence, shattering the illusion of safety their boarded-up house provided. It was a low, resonant bong, deep and mournful, vibrating through the very foundations of the earth. It was undeniably the sound of a bell, a massive, ancient bell.
Yet the bell tower was long gone, collapsed into a mound of rubble. Bong! The second toll reverberated, shaking the rickety house, sending shivers down their spines. It was impossible, yet undeniable. The sound seemed to come from the heart of the village, from the very location Min had identified as the square. Bong! The third, then the fourth. Each toll was slower, more deliberate than the last, drawing out the agony of waiting. The fog outside seemed to thicken with each chime, pressing against the windows like a vast, formless entity. Their hearts hammered in their chests, a frantic drumbeat against the relentless spectral clock. Bong! The fifth. Bong! The sixth. Each sound seemed to pull at their sanity, tearing at the edges of their composure. The air grew colder, their breath misting in front of them, even indoors. A guttural moan seemed to accompany the seventh, a low, collective sigh carried on the heavy, damp air. Bong! The eighth. Bong! The ninth.
Tu, his face ashen, suddenly sprang to his feet, his camera now held firmly, but with a desperate resolve. "I have to film this," he gasped, his eyes wild with a terrifying mixture of journalistic duty and suicidal impulse. "No one will believe us. This is everything." He lunged toward the makeshift barricade at the door, trying to pry it open. Min grabbed him, his strength fueled by terror. "Are you crazy too? The journal! Do not look at the square! Do you want to end up like Ling?" Bong! The 10th. But Tu was beyond reason. The thrill-seeker in him, the relentless pursuer of the supernatural, had completely taken over. "I have to! I can't just sit here! This is what we came for!" He struggled against Min's grip, his eyes fixed on the door, on the unseen spectacle unfolding outside. Bong! The 11th. Min knew he couldn't hold him. Tu was a force of nature when truly determined. Her, seeing the futile struggle, made a desperate decision.
"We have to go with him, Ming," she said, her voice tight with fear but resolute. "We can't let him go out there alone. If he insists on going, we go together. We watch his back." It was a terrible choice, but perhaps the only one that offered a semblance of control in a situation that had spiraled wildly out of it. Bong! The 12th. The final 13th toll seemed to stretch for an eternity, a vibrating hum that permeated their bones, their very souls. It was a sound that marked not just the passage of time, but the tearing of a veil between worlds. As the last echoes faded, leaving behind an even more profound, deathly silence, the air outside crackled with an unseen energy. The 13th night had truly begun, and they were stepping directly into its heart. With the chilling reverberations of the 13th bell still vibrating in their chests, Ming and Ha braced themselves for the inevitable. Tu, a man possessed, had already managed to pry open a small gap in their fortified doorway, a sliver of darkness that swallowed the weak lantern light. The fog outside was a living entity, thick and suffocating, swirling with an unnatural energy. It felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like a vast, unseen curtain being drawn across the world. Ming took a deep breath, the scent of damp earth and decay filling his lungs, mingling with a new, metallic tang that raised the hairs on his arms. Ha, pale but resolute, squeezed his hand before releasing it, her fingers brushing her locket once more. Together, they pushed through the makeshift barricade, stepping out into the heart of the 13th night. The village square, which Ming had only seen as a jumble of overgrown weeds and scattered stones in daylight, was now transformed. The fog was densest here, swirling in hypnotic currents,
illuminated by an eerie, internal luminescence that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was a shifting, luminous shroud that twisted and coiled, occasionally revealing the spectral outlines of the ruined buildings surrounding them. The silence was absolute, heavier than anything they had experienced before, swallowing every sound, every breath. Tu, utterly consumed by his mission, moved forward with a trance-like focus, his camera raised and already recording. The red light on his device pulsed like a tiny, terrified heart in the overwhelming white gloom. He was walking towards the very center of the square, towards the mound of rubble that had once been the bell tower, drawn by an invisible, irresistible force. Ming and Ha followed, their steps cautious, their eyes straining to penetrate the opaque fog. They held onto each other, a desperate anchor in a world that felt utterly alien.
The ground beneath their feet felt strangely soft, almost spongy, as if the earth itself were yielding to an unseen pressure. As Tu neared the center, the swirling mist began to coalesce, to thicken. It wasn't just fog anymore. It was forming shapes, indistinct at first, like distortions in the fabric of the air. Gradually, chillingly, these distortions began to resolve into human forms. They were tall, gaunt figures, their outlines indistinct, shimmering at the edges. But the most terrifying aspect was their utter lack of definition. They had no faces, no eyes, no noses, no mouths, just smooth, featureless surfaces where faces should have been. And they were naked, featureless mannequins of pure mist, barely visible, yet undeniably present. There were dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, standing in a vast, silent circle around the very spot Tu was approaching.
Their formation was slow, deliberate, each figure emerging from the swirling fog with an agonizing slowness, until a complete, unbroken ring of these faceless entities surrounded the three of them. Tu, utterly absorbed in capturing the phenomenon, stumbled back, his lens zooming in, then out, trying to encompass the impossible spectacle. He whispered frantically into the camera's microphone, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and stark terror. "My God, I'm seeing them. They have no faces, no faces." The faceless figures didn't move, didn't make a sound. They simply stood, an impenetrable wall of silent, featureless being, their ethereal forms absorbing the strange light of the square. Their presence was a profound emptiness, a void that radiated an unimaginable cold. Ming felt a scream building in his throat, but no sound escaped. He pulled Ha closer, his heart threatening to burst from his chest. This was it. The horror described in Ling's journal magnified beyond comprehension. The entities that hadn't all gone. Then, one of the figures directly in front of Tu began to move. It wasn't a walk, it was a slow, deliberate glide, a frictionless motion that defied gravity. Its ethereal form seemed to absorb the ground it passed over, leaving behind a subtle, sunken impression in the soft earth, as if its weight, though invisible, was immense. Another figure began to move, then another, until the entire ring of faceless entities started to slowly, inexorably close in on them. Panic, raw and unthinking, finally seized Tu. The thrill of discovery evaporated, replaced by the primal urge to survive. He let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure terror, and turned to flee. He sprinted blindly into the swirling fog, away from the encroaching circle, his camera still clutched in his hand, recording his panicked flight.
But the faceless figures were faster, or perhaps they didn't need to move in the conventional sense. They simply manifested, appearing ahead of him, beside him, mirroring his frantic movements. Each time his foot hit the ground, a new impression appeared, deeper, more distorted, as if the very earth was collapsing beneath the chase. The thumping sounds of the small footsteps Min had heard on the first night now seemed to echo from every direction, multiplied 100-fold, amplified by the silent, encroaching forms. The ground beneath Tu's panicked steps seemed to depress with each stride, as if the very essence of the earth was being drawn into the pursuit. Min, gripped by a desperate need to protect Ha, pulled her violently behind the nearest solid structure, a crumbling stone wall, barely taller than them, the last remnant of a forgotten building. They crouched low, pressing themselves against the cold, damp stones, their hearts pounding in unison.
From their hiding place, they could still hear Tu's terrified, gasping cries, growing fainter as he was swallowed by the relentless fog and the closing circle of silent, faceless pursuers. Then the horror deepened. From the edge of the swirling mist, a new figure began to emerge. It was unlike the others. While still ethereal and shimmering, this one had form. It solidified, gaining definition, until it stood before them, a chillingly accurate duplicate. It was Ha, her face, her hair, her clothes. But her eyes were not her own. They were the same vacant, dilated, soulless black pools that men had seen on her face just 3 days prior. And her lips moved, uttering the very same chilling words she had whispered then, in that same toneless, disembodied voice. Chúng chưa đi hết? They haven't all gone. The false Ha, her expression utterly devoid of emotion, began to glide towards them, her steps eerily silent.
Her presence radiated an unimaginable coldness, a profound sense of wrongness. Ming felt an icy terror seize him, threatening to paralyze him completely. The mimicry wasn't sheer voice, it was a physical manifestation, a horrifying doppelganger brought forth by the unholy ritual of the 13th Night. This was not a ghost, it was a void, a monstrous imitation of life, come to claim the last vestiges of their existence. The sight of Ha's doppelganger, her face a perfect soulless mask of his friend, was a blow that almost shattered Ming's resolve. The cold dread that had been building since they entered the village coalesced into a paralyzing terror. He clung to the real Ha, his body trembling uncontrollably, his eyes wide with horror as the spectral imitation glided towards them, her vacant eyes fixed on their hiding place. The air around the false Ha crackled with an unnatural energy, and a profound cold radiated from her, chilling them to the bone.
The words, Chúng chưa đi hết, echoed not just from her lips, but seemed to resonate within Ming's very skull, a direct invasion of his thoughts. It was a terrifying, intimate horror, a violation of identity itself. The real Ha, pressed against Ming, was shaking violently, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had seen her own reflection in the eyes of the mimic, the horrifying echo of her earlier episode. Yet, a spark of defiance, of pure terror, ignited within her. She was not the vacant vessel they had encountered days ago. She was present, aware, and fighting. No, Ming roared, the sound ripped from his throat, raw and desperate. He tightened his grip on her, shielding her with his body. You're not her, you're nothing. He didn't know if the words would have any effect, but he had to try. He had to scream defiance into the face of this grotesque parody. As the false hand neared, her featureless gaze unwavering, Ming's mind raced.
What did Ling's journal say about these entities? Incomplete bodies, souls seeking completion. Và Ha có một lối thu hút đáng chú ý nào, her anchor to her true self. His eyes fell on the silver locket she always wore, clutched tightly in her hand. It was a simple, old piece, engraved with a small winding river and a single stylized lotus flower. A gift from her grandmother, a cherished reminder of home and family. Ha! Ming yelled, pulling her face towards him, forcing her to look at him, to stay grounded. The locket! Think of your locket, your grandmother! Remember! He knew it was a long shot, a desperate gamble on the power of memory and personal attachment. But what else did they have? The real Ha, her eyes wide with fear, stared at her doppelganger. The mimic was now only a few feet away, her mouth open slightly, the chilling whisper about them still emanating from her. Ha's hands flew to her neck, fumbling with the silver chain, her fingers clumsy with terror. "Grandmother!" she gasped, a single tear tracing a path down her pale cheek, contrasting sharply with the dry, vacant stare of the imitation. "The river, the lotus." As if in response to her genuine memory, a subtle shift occurred in the false Ha. The ethereal shimmer around her seemed to falter, a ripple passing through her borrowed form. Her vacant eyes flickered, as if a momentary glitch had occurred in her terrifying projection. The whispering sound emanating from her mouth wavered, losing its toneless certainty. "Pull it," Ming urged, his voice cracking with urgency. "Pull it off!" With a surge of desperate strength, Ha tugged at the locket. The old clasp, weakened by time, gave way with a faint snap. The locket, a small, tangible piece of her identity, flew from her grasp, landing with a soft clang on the damp ground directly between her and her doppelganger. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic.
The moment the locket left her, the false Ha let out a silent, internal shriek. Her shimmering form distorted violently, like a reflection in turbulent water. The borrowed face, the mimicry of Ha's features, melted away, dissolving into a swirling vortex of mist. The figure reeled back, its body contorting, no longer recognizable as human. It twisted and writhed, collapsing inward, until, with a final, desperate gasp of escaping air, it dissipated completely, dissolving into a fine, gray mist that quickly vanished into the swirling fog of the square. A profound silence followed, deeper than before, broken only by their ragged breathing. The immediate threat of Ha's doppelganger was gone, vanquished by a simple, sentimental object. But the triumph was short-lived, replaced by a fresh wave of terror. The air was still thick with the ringing echoes of Thu's terrified cries. They were faint now, almost swallowed by the oppressive fog, but undeniably real. It has my face."
They heard him shriek, the words choked with ultimate horror, before being abruptly cut off. A sickening gurgle, then nothing. A silence far more chilling than any scream. Ming and Ha exchanged a horrified glance. Tu? He had looked at the square, he had run, and now, that final chilling cry. "It has my face!" The realization hit Ming with the force of a physical blow. The entities weren't just taking forms, they were becoming the people they mimicked. They were replacing them, taking their identities, consuming their very essence. As the last echo of Thu's scream faded, the dense fog in the square began a slow, deliberate retreat, thinning slightly, revealing more of the surrounding desolation. The ring of featureless figures remained, still standing, utterly silent, their forms less defined, as if waiting. But in their midst, near the ruined mound of the bell tower, a new figure began to solidify. It was undeniably Thu. His body, his clothes,
his distinctive camera still clutched in his hand. But his eyes were not Tu. They were the same vacant, dilated, utterly white eyes that had haunted her. Vahin's face, though unticemacely Tu, was devoid of all life or emotion. It was a perfect, horrifying replica, an empty vessel animated by an unseen, malevolent force. The fear that Ming had always seen in Tu, the excitement, the ambition, all gone, replaced by a cold, unsettling blankness. The new Tu, Tu's ghost, Tu's replacement, stood among the other faceless entities, as if he now belonged to their silent, terrifying assembly. He slowly, deliberately turned his head. His vacant white eyes met Min's, a chill that transcended physical cold, piercing Min's very soul. There was no recognition, no malice, just an unfathomable emptiness. It was Tu, but it was not Tu. It was the perfected mimic, the complete entity, a horror that would forever haunt Min's nightmares. He knew then, with a horrifying certainty, that Tu was gone. His friend, the adventurous cameraman, had become one of them, a silent sentinel in the abandoned square. The objective of his thesis, the pursuit of truth, had cost them dearly, too dearly. There was no more time for research, no more time for understanding. There was only time for escape. Ming pulled Ha to her feet, his mind racing with a singular, desperate thought. They had to run. They had to get out before they too became part of Huang Tik's eternal, faceless nightmare. The chilling tableau in the square, the newly formed Tu, silent and soulless, standing amidst the featureless phantoms, ignited a primal terror in Ming that transcended any academic curiosity. His pursuit of truth had led to this unspeakable horror, had cost them Tu. The weight of that realization crushed him, but it also spurred a desperate, singular focus, escape. He grabbed Ha's hand, pulling her up with a strength he didn't know he possessed.
Zun, Ha, now! He choked out, his voice raw. He didn't wait for her to respond, dragging her away from their flimsy cover, away from the horrifying spectacle to the square. Their feet pounding on the soft, damp earth, each step a desperate plea for survival. The fog, though slightly thinner, still clung to the village, blurring the outlines of the ruined houses and creating an disorienting labyrinth. The faceless entities in the square did not pursue them immediately. They merely stood, silent and still, the new Tu among them, his white, vacant eyes fixed on the retreating figures of his former friends. Their lack of immediate pursuit was almost more terrifying than a chase, suggesting an inevitability, a patient, predatory waiting. Ming didn't look back. He couldn't. The image of those dead eyes would forever be burnt into his memory. He pulled hard through the winding, overgrown paths, past the skeletons of houses they had explored, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The silence of the village, once unnerving, was now a deafening roar in his ears, amplifying the frantic beat of his own heart. He imagined ghostly whispers swirling round them, the echoes of calls that might draw them back, just as Ha had been drawn. They stumbled, fell, and picked themselves up again, driven by a raw, unthinking will to survive. The weight of their backpacks, once a familiar comfort, now felt like a crushing burden. They shed unnecessary gear, discarding anything that would slow their desperate flight. The camera Tu had always carried, the symbol of their ambition, now felt like a curse, a magnet for the unseen. The sun was still hours from rising, but a faint, almost imperceptible lightening of the sky at the eastern horizon offered a glimmer of hope. Dawn. If they could just make it to dawn, perhaps the entity's power would wane, perhaps the oppressive spell over the village would lift. They finally reached the edge of the village, the last cluster of houses where they had first seen the ominous handprints.
The broken gate, their entry point, should have been just ahead. Ming pushed through a tangle of thorny bushes, expecting to see the leaning posts, the rusted hinge, the familiar, albeit decayed, boundary marker. But it wasn't there. Where the dilapidated gate should have stood, where the village path should have met the forest trail they had followed days ago, there was only dense, impenetrable forest. Thick trees, their branches interwoven like a protective barrier, stood in an unbroken line, as if no gate had ever existed. The path they had taken, the one that led them into this nightmare, had vanished. Panic, fresh and icy, seized Min. He frantically pushed against the trees, tearing at the vines, his hands bloody from the thorns. No, it has to be here. The gate. Where's the gate? His voice was hoarse, desperate, bordering on hysteria. Ha, equally distraught, joined him, her cries mingling with his. They ran along the tree line, searching for any sign of a break, any hint of the path they had followed. But there was nothing. Only an endless, impenetrable wall of silent, ancient forest. It was as if the village had folded in on itself, severing its connection to the outside world, trapping them within its cursed boundaries. For what felt like an eternity, they searched, their hope dwindling with each fruitless attempt. Finally, exhaustion, both physical and mental, overwhelmed them. They collapsed at the base of a massive, gnarled tree, its roots like grasping fingers in the damp earth. The faint lightning of the sky continued, pushing back the darkest shadows, yet offering no real comfort. The village remained shrouded in its unnatural silence, the heavy fog slowly lifting, revealing the desolate, unchanging landscape.
As the first rays of true dawn finally pierced the dense canopy, painting the sky with streaks of faint gold, a profound shift occurred. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had gripped the village for days began to dissipate. The air grew lighter, the chill receding. A faint, almost imperceptible breeze rustled through the leaves of the outer trees, a sound they hadn't heard since they crossed the threshold. The silence remained, but it was no longer the suffocating vacuum. It was a more natural, if eerie, quiet. And with the rising sun, the forest edge, which had seemed so impenetrable moments before, revealed a faint, overgrown path. Not the clear trail they had taken, but a faint impression, as if the village itself had grudgingly allowed them a narrow escape. The gate, or what remained of it, was still gone, but the illusion of an unbroken forest had lifted. It was as if the village had released its grip, reluctantly but decisively. They didn't hesitate. Without a word, they rose and stumbled onto the path, half walking, half crawling, driven by a single, desperate impulse to put as much distance as possible between themselves và Hoang Tịch. They didn't stop until the cursed village was a distant, forgotten nightmare behind them, until the sounds of real birdsong and buzzing insects returned, gradually reasserting the presence of the living world. Weeks later, back in the bustling anonymity of the city, Ming tried to pick up the pieces of his life. He abandoned his thesis, the horrors of Hoang Tịch too raw, too personal to intellectualize. Ha, deeply traumatized, found solace in her family, a quiet retreat from the world that had stolen her memories and nearly her identity. They rarely spoke of the village, the unspoken pact between them a heavy shroud over their shared experience.
The authorities, when they tried to report what happened, listened with polite skepticism, attributing their tale to stress-induced hallucinations, the ramblings of traumatized youths. They had no proof, no corroborating evidence. Du's camera had vanished with him. One rainy afternoon, exactly 1 week after their return, Ming found a small, unmarked USB drive tucked beneath his apartment door. There was no note, no sender, just the cold, impersonal technology. His heart hammered in his chest with a terrifying premonition. He plugged it into his laptop, his fingers trembling. A single video file. He clicked play. The footage was grainy, shaky, filmed in the dim, otherworldly light of the village square. It was Du's camera, undoubtedly, capturing the swirling fog, the faceless figures. Then the camera turned, focusing on the mound of rubble that had been the bell tower. And there he stood, unmistakable, Du, his face, his clothes.
But those eyes, so utterly, terrifyingly white and vacant, staring directly into the lens. His lips moved, his voice, Du's voice, clear and chillingly calm, filled Ming's small apartment. Đêm thứ 13 tiếp theo, đến lượt các cậu. The screen went black, leaving Ming in the silence of his room. The image of Du's dead eyes burned into his mind, and the chilling promise echoing in his ears. Huang Tik hadn't let them go, not truly. And the 13th night, it seemed, was not a singular event, but a recurring, patient terror waiting for its next victims.